To the global elite, the name Porsche conjures a singular image: speed. It is the perfect curves of a 911 tearing down the Autobahn, a symbol of freedom, wealth, and the pinnacle of German engineering. But peel back that $1,000 paint job, scrape away the polished chrome, and you won't find the romance of the racetrack. You will find a blackened engine block fueled entirely by hatred. This empire wasn't built by suit-wearing entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. It was forged in the fires of World War II by a genius who shook hands with Adolf Hitler to build machines of mass slaughter. And from that bloody legacy, a 50-year civil war erupted, not between corporate rivals, but between two branches of the very same bloodline, Porsche and Piëch. They slept with each other's wives. They ambushed one another in boardrooms, and they were willing to burn the entire company to the ground just to seize the throne. This is the story of how a dynasty turned the cute Volkswagen Beetle into tanks that crushed Europe, and how their children transformed the family dinner table into the most savage financial battlefield in modern history. The blood-soaked origins. The history of the Porsche dynasty does not begin in the pristine glass-walled dealerships of modern Stuttgart, nor does it start on the glamorous curves of the Le Mans racetrack. The true origin point is a smoke-filled room in the Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin in the spring of 1933. It begins with a handshake between a brilliant, morally bankrupt engineer and a newly appointed chancellor named Adolf Hitler. This moment was the conception of the Porsche Empire, a union formed not by coercion, but by a shared megalomaniacal vision of dominance. Ferdinand Porsche is often sanitized in corporate brochures as a politically naive genius, a man who simply wanted to build cars and was swept up by the tides of history. The forensic evidence suggests a far darker reality. Ferdinand was not a victim of the Third Reich. He was one of its primary beneficiaries. He was a man who looked at the swastika and saw a blank check. For years, his radical designs had been rejected by traditional manufacturers like Daimler-Benz for being too expensive, too complex, or too weird. In Hitler, he found the ultimate angel investor, a patron with absolute power and a national budget to burn. The first fruit of this toxic partnership was the project that would define the 20th century, the Volkswagen, or people's car. Hitler demanded a vehicle that could transport 2 adults and 3 children at 100 kilometers per hour, consuming no more than 7 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, all for the price of a small motorcycle, 990 Reichsmarks. It was an impossible engineering brief for a free market. It was perfect for a dictatorship. Ferdinand Porsche threw himself into the challenge with an obsessive, almost religious fervor. The result was the Beetle, Type 1, a marvel of air-cooled efficiency. But the mechanism of its funding was a colossal state-sponsored fraud. The Nazi regime established the KDF Wagen, Strength Through Joy Car, savings scheme. Ordinary German workers were encouraged to buy stamps every week to stick into a savings booklet. 5 marks a week you must set aside if you want to drive in your own car, the slogan promised. Over 330,000 Germans poured their life savings into this program, funding the construction of the massive factory in Wolfsburg. Not a single private citizen received a car. By the time the factory was operational in 1939, the Wehrmacht had marched into Poland. The machinery that Ferdinand Porsche had designed to mobilize the masses was instantly repurposed to crush them. The tooling for the friendly, round Beetle was swapped for the angular, militarized Kübelwagen, a Jeep-like utility vehicle, and the amphibious Schwimmwagen. The savings of the German working class were effectively stolen to finance the initial infrastructure of the Porsche war machine. Ferdinand did not protest. He simply adjusted his slide rule and began designing for the front lines. The true depths of the family's complicity became apparent as the war ground on. Ferdinand Porsche was not merely a civilian contractor. He became the chairman of the German Tank Commission. He was obsessed with size and firepower, traits that mirrored the Führer's own insecurities. This alignment of egos led to the creation of the Tiger I and the Tiger II King Tiger tanks. These were not defensive weapons. They were mobile fortresses designed to terrifying specifications. Ferdinand pushed the boundaries of engineering to a point of absurdity. He developed a 60-ton tank destroyer named the Ferdinand, later the Elephant, in his own honor. It featured a revolutionary yet overcomplicated petrol-electric hybrid drive system. It was a technical marvel and a logistical nightmare. On the battlefields of Kursk, these monsters often broke down or caught fire, not from enemy action, but from their own internal complexity. Yet Ferdinand Porsche remained the Führer's favorite engineer, protected from criticism by his personal proximity to Hitler. He enjoyed the status of an industrial oligarch, wearing the SS Ehrenring, SS Honor Ring, and utilizing the war to expand his personal fiefdom. The production of these steel beasts required labor. By 1942, German men were dying by the thousands in the frozen mud of Stalingrad, leaving the factories of Wolfsburg and Stuttgart empty. A moral man might have slowed production. Ferdinand Porsche, a pragmatist of the cruelest order, turned to the darkest resource available to the Reich: human chattel. The historical archives are explicit and damning. Ferdinand Porsche did not just accept slave labor, he actively requested it. Letters and memos from the Porsche archives show him negotiating directly with SS commanders for shipments of personnel from the concentration camps. A purpose-built concentration camp, Arbeitsdorf, was constructed on the grounds of the Volkswagen factory. It was a satellite of the notorious Neuengamme camp. Later, thousands of forced laborers from the Soviet Union, Poland, and France were crammed into freezing wooden barracks surrounding the assembly lines. The conditions were medieval. Starvation was a standard management tool. Beatings were routine. Survivors described Ferdinand Porsche walking through the factory floors, stepping over the bodies of exhausted prisoners, his eyes fixed on the assembly line. He did not see human beings. He saw biological components that were cheaper to replace than to maintain. When the components broke, when they died of typhus, malnutrition, or exhaustion, they were discarded, and the SS sent a fresh trainload. The Porsche family fortune, the seed capital that would later build the 911 and the Cayenne, was fertilized by the blood of these slaves. Every Reichsmark of profit generated during these years was extracted from a crime against humanity. This is the original sin of the dynasty, a stain so deep that no amount of philanthropy or corporate restructuring has ever been able to scrub it clean. The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 brought the first real consequence to the family, though it was mild compared to their crimes. As the Allied forces swept through Germany, Ferdinand Porsche, his son Ferry Porsche, and his son-in-law Anton Piëch, a lawyer and fervent Nazi who had managed the Wolfsburg plant, fled to their estate in Zell am See, Austria. This alpine retreat, purchased with the spoils of their wartime success, became their bunker. They buried corporate documents, they hid assets, they prepared to weather the storm. French authorities, however, had other plans. In late 1945, Ferdinand, Ferry, and Anton were lured to Baden-Baden under the pretense of discussing a design contract for a French people's car. It was a trap. The French intelligence service arrested them. While Ferry was released relatively quickly to manage the crumbling business, Ferdinand Porsche and Anton Piëch were transferred to a bleak, medieval prison in Dijon. For 20 months, the great engineer and his son-in-law rotted in an unheated cell. The man who had dined with Hitler and commanded thousands of slaves was now forced to sweep floors and survive on watery soup. It was a humiliation that shattered Ferdinand's health, but it hardened his psyche. He was never put on trial at Nuremberg. He was never forced to answer for the slaves at Wolfsburg. The French wanted his brain more than they wanted justice. They forced him to consult on the design of the Renault 4CV, extracting his genius as the price for his existence. During this power vacuum, Ferry Porsche, operating from a sawmill in Austria, began to rebuild the company. He scrambled to raise the ransom money demanded by the French. He took on contract work, repairing tractors and winches, and eventually secured a lucrative deal to design a Grand Prix car for an Italian industrialist. The exorbitant fee for this design was paid directly to the French authorities. In 1947, Ferdinand Porsche and Anton Piëch were released. They returned to Austria, broken men but free. The patriarch was a shadow of his former self, his body failing, his mind darkened by bitterness. He found a company that had survived, but a family that was beginning to fracture. The death of Ferdinand Porsche in January 1951, following a stroke, was the catalyst that turned the external war into an internal one. His will was a document of fairness that resulted in chaos. He left his vast automotive empire, the design firm, the royalties from the Volkswagen Beetle, which had begun to sell in the millions, and the real estate split 50-50 between his two children, Ferry Porsche and Louise Piëch. It seemed like an equitable solution. In reality, it was a declaration of war. The two siblings were polar opposites. Ferry was the car guy, the creative soul who wanted to build lightweight sports cars, the dream that became the Porsche 356. He was quiet, conservative, and focused on the product. Louise Piëch, on the other hand, was the Iron Lady. Married to Anton Piëch, she had absorbed the ruthless, legalistic aggression of her husband. She controlled the Volkswagen distribution rights in Austria, a license that printed money. The division of assets created a binary solar system with two sons. The Porsche family controlled the factory in Stuttgart. The Piëch family controlled the money and the distribution in Salzburg. They needed each other to survive, but they despised the dependency. The children of Ferry and the children of Louise grew up in this atmosphere of armed neutrality. They spent their summers together at the Zellem Sea estate, playing in the shadow of the mountains, but the air at the dinner table was always thick with unspoken resentments. The Piëch children were raised with a military-style discipline, sent to strict boarding schools like the Zuoz Lyceum in Switzerland, trained to be tough, suspicious, and dominant. The Porsche children were educated in Waldorf schools, encouraged to be artistic, manual, and softer. This cultural divergence was not accidental, it was strategic. The Piëchs viewed the Porsches as weak mechanics who liked to tinker in the garage. The Porsches viewed the Piëchs as greedy bean counters who knew nothing about the soul of a car. Ferdinand Porsche's legacy was double-edged. He left them a name that was becoming a global brand and a fortune built on slave labor that made them untouchable. But he also left them a structure guaranteed to generate conflict. By failing to designate a single heir, by forcing the mechanic and the merchant to share the throne, he ensured that the war he helped start in 1939 would continue within the walls of his own home for generations to come. The stage was set for a blood feud that would see cousins destroying cousins, all while the world applauded the beautiful machines they created. The earth covering Ferdinand Porsche's grave in Zell am See had barely settled in 1951 when the tectonic plates of his empire began to grind against each other. The patriarch's death did not unify his children in grief. It liberated them into rivalry. The terms of his will, a document intended to be a masterpiece of fairness, became the blueprint for a 50-year civil war. By splitting the assets 50-50 between his son Ferry Porsche and his daughter Louise Piëch, the old man had created a corporate structure that guaranteed deadlock. He had built a two-headed monster, and from the moment the will was read, the heads began to snap at each other. The division was not just financial, it was geographical and philosophical, creating two distinct fiefdoms that viewed the world through radically different lenses. On one side of the Alps in Stuttgart was the Porsche clan, led by Ferry Porsche. Ferry was the gentle prince of the dynasty, a man who had inherited his father's engineering genius but lacked his ruthless edge. While his father had built tanks for the Wehrmacht, Ferry wanted to build sports cars for gentlemen. He was a dreamer who smelled of oil and modeling clay. Under his stewardship, the family name transitioned from heavy industry to high-speed luxury. Ferry's vision materialized in the Porsche 356, a lightweight, agile sports car that defied the prevailing logic of the time, which favored massive engines and brute force. The 356 was delicate, air-cooled, and essentially a highly modified Volkswagen Beetle in a tuxedo, but it was brilliant. It established the Porsche DNA. Ferry ran the Stuttgart factory like a large, chaotic artisan workshop. He valued creativity, intuition, and the feel of the road. To the Porsche side of the family, the car was an object of passion, a mechanical soul to be nurtured. On the other side of the border, in Salzburg, Austria, sat the Piëch clan, ruled by the formidable Louise Piëch. If Ferry was the dreamer, Louise was the banker. She was the widow of Anton Piëch, the Nazi lawyer who had helped run the Wolfsburg slave factories, and she had absorbed his legalistic, predatory approach to business. Louise did not make cars, she sold them, and she sold them with a monopoly that was the envy of the automotive world. Through a shrewd negotiation made by her father and husband before the war, the Piëch family held the exclusive rights to import and distribute all Volkswagen vehicles in Austria. This was the golden leash. Every time a Beetle was sold in Austria, and during the post-war economic miracle everyone bought a Beetle, the Piëch cash register rang. While Ferry Porsche had to hustle to sell his niche sports cars, risking bankruptcy with every new model, Louise Piëch simply sat back and collected a percentage of the national GDP. The forensic accounting of this era reveals a deep, festering imbalance. The Porsche clan had the fame, the Piëch clan had the cash. Ferry often found himself in the humiliating position of needing to borrow money from his sister's distribution company to fund his engineering projects. This financial dependency bred a quiet, corrosive resentment. The Porsches viewed the Piëchs as parasites who profited from a name they didn't even bear. The Piëchs viewed the Porsches as reckless spendthrifts who played with toys while the adults paid the bills. But the true poison was injected into the third generation. The conflict between Ferry and Louise was largely conducted with polite smiles and passive-aggressive contracts. The war between their children, the cousins, would be fought with knives. There were 10 cousins in total. On the Porsche side, there was Butzi, the designer of the 911, Peter, Gerhard, and Wolfgang. On the Piëch side, there was the brooding, intense Ferdinand Piëch, along with his siblings. The way these two groups were raised determined the future of the company. It was a clash of civilizations, Stuttgart liberalism versus Austrian Spartanism. Fairy Porsche, perhaps reacting against the harshness of his own father, sent his children to Waldorf schools. The Porsche boys were educated in an environment that prioritized artistic expression, eurythmy, a form of movement therapy, and emotional intelligence. They grew up soft-spoken, bearded, and artistic. They were taught that creativity flourished in freedom. They were the hippies of the automotive aristocracy, viewing the company as a legacy to be stewarded with care and consensus. The Piëch children, by contrast, were raised in a boot camp. Louise Piëch believed that softness was a fatal defect. She sent her son, Ferdinand Piëch, to the Zoos Lyceum in Switzerland, a boarding school notorious for its Spartan discipline. It was a place of cold showers, corporal punishment, and a survival of the fittest ethos. Young Ferdinand Piëch was forged in this kiln of isolation. He was dyslexic, socially awkward, and intensely competitive. At Zoos, he learned a lesson that would define his management style for the next 50 years. Trust no one. Dominate or be dominated. While his Porsche cousins were painting and learning to express their feelings, Ferdinand Piëch was learning how to hide his. He developed a reptilian stare, a gaze of unnerving, icy blue silence that would later terrify board members across Europe. He looked at his cousins and saw weakness. He saw them as soft Porsches, unworthy of the name on the building. The psychological fracture was deepened by a crisis of identity. The Porsche boys carried the magic name. They walked into a room and everyone knew who they were. Ferdinand Piëch carried the name of his father's law firm. To the outside world, he was a Piëch, a secondary character in the Porsche story. He had to work twice as hard to prove he belonged to the dynasty. This chip on his shoulder calcified into a diamond-hard ambition. He didn't just want to be part of Porsche, he wanted to conquer it. By the mid-1960s, the cousins had entered the family business, and the factory floor in Stuttgart became the arena for their gladiator matches. Ferdinand Piëch, fresh from university with a degree in engineering and a thesis on Formula One engines, joined Porsche and immediately began to destabilize the ecosystem. He was brilliant, undeniable, and utterly reckless with money. As the head of the racing division, he embarked on a scorched earth campaign to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. His masterpiece was the Porsche 917. The 917 was a car built by a madman. It was dangerously powerful, unstable, and terrifyingly fast. To build it, Piëch spent the company's budget into oblivion. When the accountants warned him that the company was running out of cash, he ignored them. When the drivers told him the car was a death trap, he told them to drive faster. He operated with the arrogance of a man who knew his mother, Louise, could always bail him out. The Porsche cousins watched this with horror. Wolfgang Porsche, the youngest and most diplomatic of the clan, saw Ferdinand Piëch not as a visionary, but as a liability. They saw him burning the family inheritance on racing trophies. They hated his abrasive style. Ferdinand Piëch would fire longtime engineers for minor mistakes. He would change designs at the last minute without consulting anyone. He treated the Porsche company not as a business, but as his personal laboratory. The tension came to a head over the budget wars. The Porsche cousins controlled the supervisory board, and they began to block Ferdinand's spending. They demanded accountability. Ferdinand responded with contempt. He viewed his cousins as bean counters, small men who didn't understand that greatness requires sacrifice. "I'm surrounded by shopkeepers," he reportedly sneered. The atmosphere at the family estate in Zell-am-See, where the clan gathered for holidays, became toxic. The Schuttgut, the name of the estate, was supposed to be a sanctuary. Instead, it was a pressure cooker. Dinners were silent affairs, where the sound of cutlery on porcelain was the only break in the tension. The Porsche boys would sit on one side, the Piëch boys on the other. The patriarchs, Ferry and Louise, tried to mediate, but they were proxies for the conflict themselves. By 1970, the situation was untenable. The company was paralyzed. The engineering department was loyal to Ferdinand Piëch. The finance department was loyal to the Porsches. Every decision, from the color of a seatbelt to the location of a new factory, became a proxy war for the soul of the dynasty. Ferry Porsche, realizing that the family was on the verge of destroying the company, attempted an intervention. He hired a professional mediator to conduct a group therapy session at Zell AMC. It was a desperate move, a billionaire family sitting in a circle trying to talk about their feelings. It was a catastrophic failure. Instead of healing, the session ripped the scabs off old wounds. The Porsche cousins accused Ferdinand Piëch of being a megalomaniac who was driving the company to bankruptcy. Ferdinand Piëch accused the Porsches of being incompetent dilettantes who were jealous of his talent. The screaming match echoed off the Alpine walls. The mediator was ignored. The therapy confirmed only one thing: these two branches of the family could not coexist in the same ecosystem. This failure set the stage for the dramatic purge that would follow. But before the legal separation could happen, the emotional rot had to reach its nadir. The resentment had been financial and professional, but it was about to become deeply, uncomfortably personal. Ferdinand Piëch, the man who felt slighted by his name and his cousins, was about to launch a nuclear strike on the family's honor. He wouldn't just attack their business acumen, he would attack their marriages. The divide was destined, but the explosion would be triggered by a scandal that no business school case study could ever predict. Building an empire on incest and civil war. The mediation session at Zell AMC had failed to cauterize the wound, leaving the family in a state of gangrenous resentment. The corporate paralysis was total. The engineering department wouldn't speak to the finance department, and the cousins wouldn't speak to each other. But Ferdinand Piëch, the master of asymmetric warfare, realized that if he couldn't win the war in the boardroom with spreadsheets, he would win it in the bedroom with psychological terror. In 1972, the conflict metastasized from a business dispute into a Grecian tragedy of lust and betrayal. The mechanism Ferdinand deployed was Marlene Porsche. Marlene was not just any woman, she was the wife of Gerd Porsche, Ferdinand's own first cousin. Gerd was Ferry Porsche's son, a quiet, unassuming man who stood firmly in the Porsche camp of the family divide. In the feudal structure of the dynasty, stealing a cousin's wife was not merely adultery. It was an act of treason, a deliberate violation of the biological and social sanctity of the clan. Ferdinand Piëch did not hide the affair. He flaunted it. He initiated a relationship with Marlene that was open, brazen, and calculated to inflict the maximum amount of shame upon the Porsche side of the family. It was a forensic strike against the masculinity and honor of his rivals. He was sending a message that was louder than any quarterly report. I can take everything you have, your company, your legacy, even your wife. The affair was not a fleeting dalliance. It lasted for 12 years. Ferdinand Piëch eventually moved in with Marlene, leaving his own wife, Carina von Planta, and 5 children behind. He fathered 2 children with Marlene. He effectively grafted a new branch onto the family tree, one that was rooted in betrayal. The psychological impact on the Porsche clan was nuclear. Gerd Porsche was humiliated. The rest of the Porsche cousins, Wolfgang, Butzi, Peter, looked at Ferdinand not just as an arrogant executive, but as a moral monster, a predator who recognized no boundaries. The dinner table at Zell-MC, already tense, became a minefield. How could they sit and discuss dividend payouts with a man who was sleeping with their brother's wife? The incestuous affair, as the tabloids gleefully, though technically incorrectly, labeled it, shattered the last remnants of trust. It proved that for Ferdinand Piëch, the concept of family was subordinate to the concept of conquest. The chaos reached the ears of the patriarchs, Ferry Porsche and Louise Piëch. They realized that their children were on the verge of destroying the company. The public image of Porsche, carefully cultivated as a purveyor of elegant engineering, was being dragged into the mud of a soap opera. The Japanese competitors were rising. The Americans were tightening regulations. Porsche could not survive if its executives were busy fighting a civil war over infidelity. In a desperate bid to save the empire from its heirs, Ferry and Louise convened a summit at the family estate in 1972. They placed a document on the heavy oak table that would change the destiny of the automotive world. History calls it the Gmund Treaty, or the Family Constitution of 1972. The terms were simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. No member of the Porsche or Piëch families could ever again hold an operational management position in the company. It was a mass firing. It was a decapitation strike aimed at their own children. To get rid of the cancer, Ferdinand Piëch, they had to amputate the healthy limbs, Butzi Porsche and the others as well. Everyone had to go. The cousins were stripped of their executive titles. They were banished to the supervisory board, a place where they could look at the numbers and collect their dividends, but where they could not touch the steering wheel. The reaction to this treaty revealed the fundamental difference between the two clans. Butzi Porsche, the creator of the 911, accepted the exile with relief. He was an artist, not a fighter. He took his severance, walked away, and founded Porsche Design, a studio where he could design sunglasses, watches, and pens in peace, far away from the toxic ambition of his cousin. For the Porsche branch, the treaty was a return to sanity. Ferdinand Piëch, however, viewed the treaty not as a peace deal, but as a declaration of war. He smiled as he signed the document, but his mind was already plotting the counterinsurgency. He saw the treaty for what it was, a mechanism designed specifically to cage him. His mother, Louise, had essentially agreed to fire him to keep the peace with her brother Ferry. The irony of the Gmund Treaty is staggering. The family intended to neutralize Ferdinand Piëch by kicking him out of Porsche. Instead, they unchained a monster. By forcing him out of the small family-run pond of Porsche, they pushed him into the vast shark-infested ocean of the wider automotive industry. If he had stayed at Porsche, he might have remained a brilliant but difficult chief engineer, contained by the limitations of a niche sports car maker. By firing him, they forced him to seek a new kingdom. Ferdinand Piëch packed his bags. He did not go quietly into the night to design sunglasses. He went to Audi, a subsidiary of Volkswagen that was, at the time, a dying brand making boring cars for retirees. He arrived at Audi with a chip on his shoulder the size of an engine block. He was driven by a single burning motivation: to prove them wrong, to build an empire that would eclipse the one he was thrown out of. The fake peace treaty of 1972 solved nothing. It merely shifted the battlefield. Inside the Porsche boardroom, the family members were replaced by professional managers, hired guns who were supposed to be neutral. But the family still pulled the strings from the shadows. The animosity didn't vanish. It went underground. The Porsche cousins, led by Wolfgang Porsche, retreated into the role of wealthy guardians. They enjoyed their lives. They collected classic cars. They hunted on the family estate. They believed the problem was solved. They believed Ferdinand Piëch was gone. relegated to a second-tier car company in Ingolstadt. They were catastrophically wrong. While the Porsches were enjoying their peace, Ferdinand Piëch was building a war machine at Audi. He channeled his rage into innovation. He introduced the Quattro all-wheel drive system, transforming rally racing forever. He introduced galvanized steel bodies. He pushed the engineers at Audi to the breaking point, ruling by fear and intimidation. He was replicating the Porsche culture, the obsession with technology and speed, but injecting it into a mass-market manufacturer. He was building his own power base, independent of the family trust. Every success at Audi was a middle finger raised in the direction of Stuttgart. He used his personal life, too, as a weapon of chaos. After the affair with Marlene ended, he moved on to the family's nanny, Ursula Placer. He married her and had another 3 children. In total, he would father 12 or 13 children. The exact number is often debated, with 4 different women. He was creating his own tribe, a private army of heirs, completely disregarding the Catholic bourgeois morality that the Porsche clan held dear. The 1970s and 80s were the Cold War era of the dynasty. On the surface, there was peace. The annual dividends were paid, the family gathered for photo ops, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates were moving. Ferdinand Piëch was climbing the ladder at the Volkswagen Group, rising from Audi to the very top of the parent company. The Porsche clan watched his ascent with a mixture of admiration and dread. They realized too late that the Gmünd Treaty had a fatal loophole. It banned family members from working at Porsche, but it said nothing about working at Volkswagen. And since the families owned a huge chunk of Volkswagen via their historic distribution rights, Ferdinand was essentially climbing up the ladder to become his cousin's boss. The peace treaty was a fraud because it ignored the nature of the combatants. You cannot sign a treaty with a hurricane. Ferdinand Piëch was a force of nature fueled by rejection. The moment he walked out the door of the Porsche factory in 1972, the clock started ticking on his revenge. He spent the next 20 years sharpening his knife, waiting for the moment when he could return not as a cousin, but as a conqueror. The family thought they had exiled Napoleon to Elba. In reality, they had just given him the time to plan Waterloo. If the Gmünd Treaty was intended to be a cage, the Porsche family forgot that cages only work if the beast agrees to be tamed. Ingolstadt, the home of Audi, was supposed to be Piëch's prison. Instead, he treated it as his boot camp. The family believed they had banished him to obscurity. In reality, they had handed him a blank canvas and a loaded gun. What followed was one of the most terrifyingly effective corporate ascents in the history of capitalism. Ferdinand Piëch did not just climb the ladder, he burned the ladder behind him so no one could follow. Over the next 3 decades, he transformed himself from a disgraced cousin into the undisputed auto-czar of Europe. He became the dark gravity that held the entire Volkswagen Group together, a man who combined the engineering brilliance of his grandfather with a leadership style that bordered on sociopathic. The mechanism of his rule was terror. Piëch did not believe in consensus. He did not believe in focus groups. He believed in the absolute crushing weight of his own will. He operated on a Darwinian philosophy that viewed kindness as an inefficiency. When he took over as the chairman of the board of management at Volkswagen AG in 1993, the company was bleeding money, paralyzed by high costs and low quality. 3 months later, it was profitable. He achieved this not by gentle restructuring, but by executing a night of the long knives in the boardroom. He fired almost the entire management board. He walked into meetings with a smile that was described by subordinates as the smile of a shark before it bites. He would sit in silence, staring at an executive who was presenting a report. If Piëch frowned, the executive's career was often over by lunch. If he stayed silent, you lived to fight another day. He created a culture where mistakes were not learning opportunities. They were terminal events. Decades later, the German magazine Der Spiegel would describe the atmosphere inside VW under Piëch as North Korea without the labor camps. But unlike a typical tyrant who rules only by fear, Piëch commanded a terrified respect because he was invariably the smartest person in the room. He was a car guy in the purest, most visceral sense. He could disassemble an engine block with his bare hands. He could feel a variance of a millimeter in a suspension setup just by driving the car around a track. When engineers told him something was impossible, he didn't fire them immediately. He told them to do it anyway, or he would find someone who could. The resurrection of Audi was his first masterstroke. He forced the engineers to develop the Quattro all-wheel drive system, a technology everyone said was too heavy and complex for passenger cars. Piëch ignored the physics and focused on the traction. The Audi Quattro dominated rally racing, obliterating the competition and transforming Audi from a joke into a premium rival to BMW and Mercedes. It was a victory of will over convention. However, his true ambition was not just to build better cars, it was to build an empire that would make the Porsche family look like small-time shopkeepers. He wanted to collect crowns. In the late 1990s, Piëch went on a shopping spree that stunned the automotive world. He didn't look at balance sheets, he looked at heritage. He bought Bentley, he bought Lamborghini, he bought Bugatti. These were not rational business decisions. They were broken, money-losing brands. But Piëch saw them as jewels for his crown. He wanted to own the pinnacle of every segment. He wanted the fastest, the most luxurious, the most brutal machines on earth under his thumb. The manifestation of his ego was the Bugatti Veyron. The Veyron was not a car. It was a mechanical monument to Ferdinand Piëch's vanity. He sketched the requirements on a napkin in a restaurant and handed it to his terrified head of engineering. The demands were insane. 1,000 horsepower, top speed of over 400 kilometers per hour. But it must be comfortable enough to drive to the opera. The engineers told him it couldn't be done. The physics of cooling a 1,000 horsepower engine packaged in a luxury car were impossible. The car would melt. The tires would disintegrate at that speed. The gearbox would shatter. Piëch's response was typical: make it happen. The development of the Veyron was a torture chamber for the engineering team. Dozens of prototypes caught fire. Transmissions exploded. But Piëch refused to compromise on a single horsepower. He burned through billions of Volkswagen's euros, money generated by the humble Golf and Jetta, to fund this hypercar. When the Veyron finally launched, it was a technological miracle. It did exactly what he said it would do. It was a triumph of engineering, but a disaster of economics. VW lost millions on every single Veyron sold. But profit was not the point. The point was dominance. The Veyron existed to prove that Ferdinand Piëch could do what no one else could. It was a message to the world, and specifically to his cousins in Stuttgart. Look what I built. Look at the power I command. While the Porsche family was carefully managing their 911 lineage, Piëch was breaking the laws of physics. This era of expansion solidified his reputation as the Baochua Tiantai, genius tyrant, but it also solidified his role as the family traitor. While he was building this empire, he remained a major shareholder in the Porsche family holding company. He was playing a double game. He was the emperor of Volkswagen, but he was also a voting member of the Porsche clan. He used his position at VW to torment his cousins. When Porsche, the company, needed a platform for their new SUV, the Cayenne, they had to come to VW to beg for partnership. Piëch granted it, but on his terms. He forced his cousins to kiss the ring. He reveled in the discomfort of Wolfgang Porsche, his younger cousin who had become the face of the Porsche clan. Wolfgang was soft, diplomatic, and averse to conflict. Ferdinand was hard, abrasive, and lived for conflict. In board meetings, Ferdinand would often undermine Wolfgang, making subtle digs at his lack of engineering knowledge, reminding everyone that while Wolfgang inherited a company, Ferdinand had built one. Piëch's personal life mirrored his corporate ruthlessness. He treated his children and wives with the same transactional coldness he applied to his employees. He once famously remarked that he had about 12 or 13 children, a vagueness that chilled interviewers. He pitted his children against each other, suggesting that only the strongest would inherit his favor. He was replicating the trauma of his own upbringing, passing the virus of the ZLMC education down to the next generation. By the mid-2000s, Ferdinand Piëch had achieved a status that was almost mythical. He was untouchable. He had survived scandals, recessions, and family wars. He had turned Volkswagen into a global behemoth that swallowed competitors whole. He sat on the supervisory board like a spider in the center of a massive web, pulling strings that connected Wolfsburg, Ingolstadt, Stuttgart, and Crewe. But deep down, the wound of 1972 never healed. The fact that his name was Piëch and not Porsche still gnawed at him. The fact that he had been fired by his own mother and uncle still burned. He had conquered the world, but he hadn't conquered his own family. He watched from his throne in Wolfsburg as the Porsche company, under the leadership of a hired CEO named Wendelin Wiedeking, began to grow incredibly profitable. The David of Porsche was getting rich, and they were getting arrogant. They began to look at the Goliath of Volkswagen not as a partner, but as a target. Ferdinand Piëch saw the ambition rising in Stuttgart. He saw his cousin Wolfgang and CEO Wiedeking plotting something big. A lesser man might have warned them. A lesser man might have tried to stop them to save the family fortune. Ferdinand Piëch did the opposite. He sat back, he folded his hands, and he waited. He knew that hubris is the most flammable element in the periodic table of business. He watched his cousins load the gun, aim it at their own heads, and prepare to pull the trigger. The genius tyrant knew that the most effective way to destroy an enemy is not to attack them, but to let them destroy themselves while you watch from the high ground, holding the deed to the cemetery. By the mid-2000s, the geopolitical map of the automotive universe appeared to be settled law. Volkswagen AG stood as the colossal Goliath of the industry, a sprawling industrial nation-state that churned out millions of vehicles annually, ranging from the utilitarian Golf to the imperial Bugatti. In contrast, Porsche SE was the David, a boutique manufacturer nestled in the hills of Stuttgart, producing fewer than 100,000 sports cars a year. But within the distorted reality of the Porsche Piëch dynasty, physical size was merely an optical illusion, and the gravitational pull of the grandfather's legacy was beginning to warp the fundamental laws of economics. The Porsche clan, led by the quiet but deeply resentful Wolfgang Porsche, began to succumb to a collective hallucination, a fever dream born of decades of inferiority. They began to ask a question that defied sanity. What if the little sports car company could simply open its mouth and swallow the giant whole? The architect of this audacious insanity was not a family member, but a mercenary of the highest order. Wendelin Wiedeking, the CEO of Porsche, was a man of staggering arrogance and undeniable brilliance, a figure who strode through the factory floors like a 19th century robber baron dropped into the modern age. When he took the reins of Porsche in the early 90s, the company was on the brink of bankruptcy, but by 2007, he had transformed it into the most profitable car company per unit in the world. He was the highest paid executive in Germany, earning more than the CEOs of Deutsche Bank and Siemens combined. And he whispered a seductive narrative into the ears of Wolfgang Porsche and the supervisory board. He told them that Volkswagen was inefficient, bloated, and ripe for the taking. He reminded them that their grandfather had designed the Beetle and that their family owned the distribution rights. He convinced them that they should no longer be satisfied with being a supplier to VW. They should become its master. It was a siren song that appealed to the deepest insecurity of the Porsche clan, the fear that they were eternally destined to be the junior partners to the Piëch-controlled empire. They gave Wiedeking the green light to execute the David Plan, a scheme that would result in the most aggressive hostile takeover disguised as a hedge fund operation in financial history. The mechanism Wiedeking deployed was financial engineering of the most opaque and predatory kind. Porsche began to accumulate cash, not from selling the 911 but from borrowing. They leveraged the company's pristine credit rating to take out billions in loans, turning the sports car maker into a massive hedge fund that just happened to manufacture vehicles on the side. Instead of buying Volkswagen shares outright, which would have driven the price up and alerted the market to their intentions, Wiedeking and his chief financial officer, Holger Herter, entered the derivatives market. They began buying cash-settled options, complex financial instruments that allowed Porsche to bet on the rise of VW's stock price without actually taking ownership of the shares until they were ready. It was a stealth accumulation, a silent creeping barrage. To the outside world, and specifically to the regulators at the BaFin, Porsche claimed it was merely hedging its exposure to VW. They issued press releases categorically denying any intention of a takeover, lying to the faces of the global financial community with the cool detachment of professional poker players. "We are not speculating," they insisted while they were secretly cornering the market. While this stealth operation was underway, the global financial world looked at Volkswagen stock and saw a bubble. Hedge funds in London and New York, the so-called smart money, believed that VW was hopelessly overvalued in a dying economy, especially as the shadow of the 2008 crash began to loom over the horizon. These funds did what they always do when they smell blood. They shorted the stock. They bet billions of dollars that Volkswagen shares would fall. They borrowed shares, sold them at the current high price, and waited to buy them back cheaper to pocket the difference. They believed they were betting against a bloated dinosaur, unaware that the dinosaur was being piloted by a shark that had already rigged the game. The trap snapped shut on a quiet Sunday afternoon, October 26, 2008. The global financial markets were already in freefall due to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and panic was the default state of the world. At this moment of maximum vulnerability, Porsche dropped a press release that hit the markets with the force of a bunker-busting bomb. The statement was dry, legalistic, and absolutely devastating. It revealed that through their covert option strategy, Porsche SE now controlled 42.6% of Volkswagen shares outright and held options for another 31.5%. The arithmetic took a moment to sink in, but when it did, the blood drained from the faces of traders from Canary Wharf to Wall Street. The math was suffocating. With Porsche controlling nearly 75% and the state of Lower Saxony holding its immovable 20% stake, the total amount of locked shares was over 94%. That left a free float of less than 6% of shares available for trading in the entire world. The catastrophe for the hedge funds lay in the fact that they had shorted 12% of the company. The equation was physically impossible. The short sellers had to buy shares to close their positions and stop their catastrophic losses, but there were no shares to buy. Porsche had bought them all. The supply was zero, and the demand was infinite. On Monday morning, the market opened and the infinity squeeze began. The stock price of Volkswagen did not climb. It teleported. It went from 200 euros to 400, then 600, then 800. Panic turned to hysteria on the trading floors. Grown men were screaming into telephones, offering any price to get out of the trade. They were begging. They were liquidating other blue-chip assets like Apple, Google, and gold just to raise the cash to pay the ransom to Porsche. On Tuesday, the price briefly touched 1,005 euros. At that singular, insane moment, Volkswagen AG, a company making diesel hatchbacks in Lower Saxony, became the most valuable company on earth, surpassing ExxonMobil in market capitalization. In the boardrooms of Stuttgart, the champagne corks were popping. Wolfgang Porsche and Wendelin Wiedeking believed they had done the impossible. They had brought the giant to its knees. On paper, they had made billions of euros in profit in a matter of hours. They had humiliated the London hedge funds and proved that the little Porsche family was the smartest predator in the jungle. They were drunk on their own brilliance, preparing to march into Wolfsburg and install themselves as the new emperors of the automotive world. But amidst the celebration, there was one man who was not drinking champagne. He was sitting in his office in Wolfsburg, or perhaps at his villa in Salzburg, watching the ticker tape with eyes of cold blue glass. Ferdinand Piëch, the chairman of Volkswagen and the genius tyrant, had known. Of course he had known. As a member of the Porsche family board and the VW board, he sat at the intersection of the information flow. He had watched his cousin Wolfgang and the arrogant Wiedeking build this house of cards. He had watched them load the company with billions of euros in debt to fund this gambling spree. The forensic interpretation suggests that Piëch allowed the takeover attempt to proceed because he saw the fatal flaw that Wolfgang missed. He understood the mechanism of hubris better than anyone. He knew that the infinity squeeze was an artificial peak, a sugar high that would inevitably crash. He knew that Porsche had not bought VW with cash. They had bought it with debt, massive, suffocating variable rate debt. And Piëch knew something else that his cousins were ignoring. The world was breaking. The 2008 global financial crisis was not just a dip, it was a tsunami. Credit markets were freezing. Banks were stopping their lending. The bill for Porsche's billions in loans was coming due, and the banks were about to turn off the tap. Wolfgang Porsche thought he was the hunter who had trapped the beast. He didn't realize that by swallowing the whale, the ant had stretched its stomach to the point of rupture. Porsche was now holding a massive amount of VW stock that it couldn't sell without crashing the price, and owing billions to banks that were terrified of lending. Ferdinand Piëch, the master tactician, did not panic during the squeeze. He didn't issue angry press releases. He simply waited for the hangover. He knew that when the stock price normalized, Porsche would be left holding a bag of debt so heavy it would drown them. He was preparing for the ultimate plot twist, ready to demonstrate that in the Game of Thrones, winning a battle is meaningless if you bankrupt your army to do it. The ant eats the whale moment was the zenith of the Porsche branch's ambition, a moment of supreme financial violence. But as the ticker tape cooled, Ferdinand Piëch was waiting at the bottom of the mountain, holding the air tank and preparing to name his price. The euphoria of the infinity squeeze in October 2008 was a narcotic high that masked a fatal internal hemorrhage. For a few brief days, the Porsche executives in Stuttgart walked the corridors like masters of the universe, drunk on the illusion that they had conquered the largest car manufacturer in Europe. But as the champagne bubbles went flat, the cold gray dawn of reality revealed the precariousness of their position. They had bought Volkswagen, not with cash, but with a mountain of debt that was structured on the assumption that the world would remain stable. They had bet the entire farm on a sunny day, unaware that a Category 5 hurricane was already making landfall. The mechanism that Ferdinand Piëch employed to destroy his cousins was not a boardroom vote or a media campaign. It was the weaponization of the global credit markets. The timing of the Porsche takeover attempt could not have been more catastrophic. Just weeks after the squeeze, the contagion from the collapse of Lehman Brothers infected the European banking system. The credit taps, which had been flowing freely for a decade, were suddenly turned off. The syndicate of banks that had lent Porsche 10 billion euros to fund their gambling spree began to panic. They looked at the balance sheet of this small sports car maker and realized it was leveraged to the point of insanity. The debt was toxic. The collateral, the Volkswagen shares, was volatile. And the banks did what banks always do when fear replaces greed. They called in the loans. In the spring of 2009, Porsche SE faced a liquidity drought that threatened to turn into instant insolvency. They needed to roll over billions of euros in debt just to keep the lights on, but no one would lend to them. The David who had tried to swallow Goliath was now choking on the bone. The predator had overextended its jaw, and now it was paralyzed, vulnerable, and suffocating. This was the moment Ferdinand Piëch had been waiting for. From his vantage point, as the chairman of Volkswagen and a major shareholder of Porsche, Piëch watched the desperation grow in Stuttgart with the patience of a crocodile. He knew exactly how much money they owed. He knew exactly when the loans were due. And he knew that there was only one entity on earth with enough cash to save them: Volkswagen itself. The tables had turned with a violent, sickening speed. Wolfgang Porsche, the cousin who had dreamed of ruling the empire, was forced to descend from his high castle and beg for a lifeline. The humiliation was absolute. The Porsche clan had to approach the very company they had tried to hostilely acquire and ask for a bailout. The negotiations that followed were less of a business transaction and more of a ritual sacrifice. Ferdinand Piëch did not offer charity. He did not offer a bridge loan to help his family through a rough patch. He offered an ultimatum. He would save the family fortune, but the price was the independence of the Porsche company. Piëch's counter move was a masterclass in corporate jiu-jitsu. He proposed a merger, a polite word that barely concealed the reality of a reverse takeover. Volkswagen would act as the white knight, paying off Porsche's debts, but in exchange, Volkswagen would acquire the crown jewel, Porsche AG, the car-making business. The family would retain control of the holding company, but the factory, the brand, the engineers, and the legacy of the 911 would become just another subsidiary of the Volkswagen Group, sitting on the shelf next to Skoda and Seat. For Wolfgang Porsche, this was a spiritual death. His father, Ferry Porsche, had spent his life fighting to keep the company independent, small, and pure. He had warned against the corrupting influence of mass production. Now, his son was being forced to hand the keys to the factory over to the very behemoth they had despised. And the man taking the keys was the cousin they had exiled 40 years earlier. The drama culminated in a series of board meetings in the summer of 2009 that were described by witnesses as Shakespearean in their cruelty. The first casualty was Wendelin Wiedeking. The CEO who had made the family billions was now a liability. Piëch demanded his head. Wiedeking, the man who had dared to challenge the Piëch supremacy, was fired. His exit was cushioned by a golden parachute of 50 million euros, a payout so obscene that it triggered investigations and public outrage across Germany. But his career was over. He walked out of the building, leaving behind a shattered strategy and a triumphant Ferdinand Piëch. With Wiedeking gone, the path was clear for Piëch to execute the plot twist. On July 23, 2009, the supervisory board approved the deal. Volkswagen would pay approximately 4 billion euros to buy a 49.9% stake in Porsche AG, with the intention to buy the rest later, which they did in 2012. The hunter had been swallowed by the prey. The imagery of the press conference announcing the deal was potent. Ferdinand Piëch stood on the podium, tears streaming down his face. To the uninitiated, these looked like tears of sentimental joy, the emotion of a man seeing his grandfather's two companies finally reunited under one roof. But the forensic psychological interpretation suggests something far more complex. These were tears of victory. They were the tears of a man who had spent his entire life being treated as the outsider, the technocrat, the dangerous one, and who had finally proven that he was the only true heir to the throne. He had not just merged the companies, he had conquered his cousins. He had forced them to bend the knee. The deal fundamentally reshaped the structure of the dynasty. The Porsche family was still incredibly wealthy. In fact, the merger eventually made them even richer as VW stock recovered. But they had lost their soul. They were no longer the proprietors of an independent artisan workshop. They were merely major shareholders in a global industrial conglomerate. Wolfgang Porsche had retained his wealth but lost his purpose. He cut a tragic figure in the aftermath, a man who had reached for the sun and had his wings melted by the icy stare of his cousin. Ferdinand Piëch, on the other hand, had achieved apotheosis. He now controlled everything. He was the chairman of a group that included Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, Bentley, Bugatti, Lamborghini, Scania, and MAN. He had built the largest, most powerful automotive empire in European history. He had vindicated his mother, Louise, and avenged the slight of the Gmünd Treaty. He had proven that while the Porsches might have the name, the Piëchs had the power. However, the reverse takeover left a trail of wreckage that would take years to clear. The legal fallout from the failed takeover attempt haunted the family for a decade. Hedge funds sued for billions, claiming market manipulation. Prosecutors launched investigations into Wolfgang Porsche and Holger Herder. The stress of the plot twist fractured the family even further. The peace that followed was the peace of a graveyard, maintained only because one side had been completely disarmed. Yet, even in his moment of absolute triumph, Ferdinand Piëch remained a creature of paranoia. He knew that power acquired through ruthlessness is never secure. He had humiliated his cousins, but he had not eliminated them. They were still on the board. They still had voting rights. And now they had a reason to hate him that went beyond childhood rivalries. They had been publicly gelded. As the dust settled on the merger in 2012, the world applauded the logic of the industrial consolidation. It made sense to share platforms and engines. But for the family, the merger was a scar tissue formed over a deep infected wound. Ferdinand Piëch had won the war of 2008, but he had done so by sacrificing the last shred of trust within the clan. He had solidified his reputation as a man who would burn his own house down to rule over the ashes. The plot twist was complete. The ant didn't eat the whale. The whale waited until the ant was tired and then simply rolled over and crushed it. But the story of the Porsche Piëch dynasty is never about a single victory. It is a cycle of destruction. Ferdinand Piëch sat on his throne, the autocsar of the world, unaware that the very culture of fear and silence he had installed at Volkswagen, the culture that allowed him to dominate his family, was silently breeding a new catastrophe in the engineering labs. A catastrophe made of software code and nitrogen oxide. The David was defeated, but a new invisible enemy was growing in the exhaust pipes of the empire he had just consolidated. The plot twist of 2009 was a financial drama. The next act would be a criminal one. Was the biggest fraud in history actually just a personal family grudge? By 2012, Ferdinand Piëch sat upon a throne of absolute conquest, having forcibly integrated Porsche into his empire and solidified Volkswagen as the supreme automotive power in Europe. Yet history teaches that the most dangerous moment for a tyrant is not during the war, but during the peace. With no external enemies left to destroy, the genius tyrant turned his gaze inward, scanning the horizon for disloyalty with the paranoia of a Roman emperor. The corporate culture he had engineered, a machine lubricated by fear and driven by impossible demands, was humming along perfectly. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building to a catastrophic failure point. The next chapter of the dynasty would not be defined by a merger or a stock price, but by a cloud of poisonous gas and a timing of events so suspicious that it borders on the supernatural. But the seeds of the coming cataclysm were sown in the body count of Piëch's reign. Throughout his tenure, there was a disturbing pattern. Any executive who grew too tall, too independent, or too widely admired was swiftly and surgically removed. The mechanism of these removals was never allowed public execution. It was always a quiet, sudden destabilization. In 2006, Baron Piëch's Reader, the CEO handpicked by Piëch to run Volkswagen, was unceremoniously fired. His crime was not incompetence, it was independence. He had dared to challenge the patriarch's authority. Next came Wolfgang Bernhard, a rising star known for his brilliance and cost-cutting prowess. He too was purged before he could threaten the throne. Piëch operated like a gardener pruning a bonsai tree, cutting off any branch that dared to spoil the shape of his vision. In their place, Piëch installed Martin Winterkorn. Winterkorn was supposed to be the perfect vassal. He was a car guy, a detail-obsessed micromanager who mirrored Piëch's own obsession with engineering perfection. For years, they were the dynamic duo. Winterkorn was the executor, the man who carried the ruler measure and screamed at engineers about gap tolerances, while Piëch was the visionary who pointed the finger at the next conquest. Under their joint rule, VW grew to become the largest car manufacturer in the world, surpassing Toyota. But by early 2015, the atmosphere shifted. Winterkorn had become powerful in his own right. The press called him Mr. Volkswagen. He was earning nearly 20 million euros a year. He began to believe that he was the natural successor to the patriarch. Ferdinand Piëch, watching from his villa in Salzburg, decided that the bonsai tree needed pruning again. In April 2015, Piëch dropped a bomb. He gave a cryptic quote to the German magazine Der Spiegel, "I am at a distance from Winterkorn." In the coded language of the German corporate elite, this was a death sentence. It was a public declaration of no confidence. Historically, when Piëch distanced himself from a CEO, that CEO was gone within weeks. Piëch expected the supervisory board, including his cousin Wolfgang Porsche, to fall in line as they always had. He expected Winterkorn to resign in shame. But then the unimaginable happened. The family fought back. Wolfgang Porsche, perhaps finally finding his spine after the humiliation of 2009, refused to support the execution. The labor unions, who held half the seats on the board and hated Piëch's slash-and-burn tactics, sided with Winterkorn. The state of Lower Saxony sided with Winterkorn. Ferdinand Piëch found himself isolated. For the first time in his life, the old man had miscalculated. He had fired a shot at the king, and he had missed. On April 25, 2015, facing a humiliating vote of removal, Ferdinand Piëch resigned. He walked away from the empire he had built. He sold his shares. He left the board. It seemed like the ultimate defeat, a lion dying in the winter, cast out by the pride he created. The media celebrated the victory of democracy at Volkswagen. Martin Winterkorn was hailed as the survivor, the man who slew the dragon. 5 months later, the world realized that Ferdinand Piëch hadn't been defeated. He had escaped. On September 18, 2015, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, issued a notice of violation that shattered the global automotive industry. They revealed that Volkswagen had been systematically cheating on emissions tests for years. This was Dieselgate. The forensic details of the scandal revealed a fraud of breathtaking audacity. Volkswagen engineers had installed defeat device software in 11 million diesel vehicles worldwide. The code was sinister in its simplicity. The car's computer could detect when it was being tested in a laboratory, based on the steering wheel position and lack of movement. When it sensed a test, it would switch the engine into a clean mode, injecting urea and throttling performance to meet strict U.S. emission standards. But the moment the car was on the road, the software switched to dirty mode, spewing nitrogen oxide NOx at levels up to 40 times the legal limit. Nitrogen oxide is not a harmless gas. It causes asthma, respiratory disease, and premature death. Volkswagen wasn't just cheating the taxman, they were poisoning the population. As the scandal unraveled, the why became as important as the how. Why would a company with such immense resources resort to such a crude cheat? The answer led directly back to the culture created by Ferdinand Piëch and maintained by Martin Winterkorn. It was a culture of terror. Years earlier, Piëch and Winterkorn had set a strategic goal: conquer America with diesel. They believed that German diesel technology was superior to Japanese hybrids. They demanded an engine that was powerful, fuel-efficient, and clean enough to pass the draconian California emissions laws. And, crucially, it had to be cheap. The engineers looked at the physics and realized it was impossible. To make the engine clean enough, they needed an expensive AdBlue urea tank system that would require frequent refills and drive up the cost. But in the Wolfsburg of Ferdinand Piëch, you did not tell the boss that something was impossible. If you did, you were fired and replaced by someone who would say yes. Faced with the choice between losing their careers or cheating the code, the engineers chose the cheat. It was the direct result of a management style that ruled by fear. The defeat device was not a glitch. It was a survival mechanism for employees working in a dictatorship. The timing of the revelation casts a haunting shadow over Ferdinand Piëch's resignation. Forensic observers and conspiracy theorists alike have obsessed over the dates. Piëch resigned in April 2015. The scandal broke in September 2015. Did he know? The official narrative is that Piëch was unaware, but this defies the psychological profile of the man. Ferdinand Piëch was an engineer who knew the thread counts of the screws in the door handles. He was a micromanager who personally test drove prototypes in the desert. Is it plausible that the man who built the empire who knew every technical secret, was ignorant of the single most critical strategy for the American market? A darker hypothesis suggests that Piëch knew exactly what was ticking inside the engines. Some insiders believe that he tried to fire Winterkorn in April not because of a vague distance, but because he knew the scandal was about to blow, and he wanted to pin it on Winterkorn before the ship went down. When the board refused to fire Winterkorn, Piëch effectively said, "Fine, if you want him, you can have him, and you can have the iceberg that's coming with him." His resignation looks less like a defeat and more like a tactical ejection. By leaving the board 5 months before the EPA notice, he legally severed his responsibility. When the police raided the headquarters, when the stock price collapsed by 50%, when Martin Winterkorn was indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice and forced to resign in disgrace, Ferdinand Piëch was sitting safely in his villa, legally untouchable. The aftermath of Dieselgate was a bloodbath for the legacy of the Porsche Piëch clan. The company was forced to pay over 30 billion euros in fines and settlements. The reputation of German engineering, the brand equity that had taken 70 years to build, was incinerated overnight. Executives went to prison. Oliver Schmidt, a VW manager, was marched through a U.S. federal court in shackles. Yet amidst the wreckage, Ferdinand Piëch remained a ghost. He refused to testify to the German parliament, citing his right to silence. When he finally did speak to prosecutors in a leaked testimony, he delivered a final brutal blow to his cousin. He alleged that he had informed the steering committee, including Wolfgang Porsche, about potential emissions issues months before the scandal broke, but they had ignored him. With this testimony, he effectively threw the grenade back into the family bunker. He painted his cousin Wolfgang and the others as either incompetent or complicit. It was the ultimate "I told you so." The suspicious deaths of this era were not physical, but reputational. Martin Winterkorn, the man who defied Piëch, saw his legacy destroyed. He became a pariah, facing criminal charges and losing his fortune. Wolfgang Porsche was left to steward a company that was financially crippled and morally bankrupt. Forced to apologize to the world for a fraud he claimed he didn't understand. Ferdinand Piëch's role in Dieselgate remains the great black box of the family history. Was he the architect of the culture that caused it? Yes. Did he authorize the cheat? We may never know. Did he use the knowledge of the cheat to try and destroy his rival, and then eject himself when the plan failed? The forensic timeline suggests a level of Machiavellian foresight that is consistent with his character. He left the stage not as a villain caught in the act, but as a prophet of doom who washed his hands of the tragedy just seconds before the curtain fell. He let the poison gas consume his enemies, while he watched from the clean air of retirement, having exacted a revenge so complex and destructive that it nearly took down the entire German economy. The genius tyrant had proven that he could build a car company from nothing, and he could also ensure that without him, it would drive straight off a cliff. The resignation of Ferdinand Piëch in 2015 and the subsequent explosion of the Dieselgate scandal did not mark the end of the war. It merely marked the beginning of the Cold Peace. For the first time in 4 decades, the boardroom of the Volkswagen Group was free of the terrified silence that accompanied the presence of the genius tyrant. But the vacuum he left behind was quickly filled by a new form of existential dread. The family had survived the internal combustion of their egos, but they were left standing in the wreckage of a reputation that had been incinerated by fraud. The Porsche and Piëch clans, still legally joined at the hip through their controlling interest in the conglomerate, retreated to their Alpine fortress in Zell Sea to lick their wounds. They were wealthier than they had ever been, their dividends flowing in like a tidal wave, even as the company paid billions in fines. But the forensic reality of their bond had shifted. They were no longer a family. They were a syndicate, a collective of billionaires who despised each other but were terrified of the cost of divorce. The final act of Ferdinand Piëch's life was played out with the same dramatic, destructive flair that characterized his reign. After his ejection from the throne in 2015, he became a king in exile, brooding in his villas, watching the company he built stumble through courtrooms and congressional hearings. He viewed the chaos not with regret, but with a vindictive satisfaction. In his mind, the collapse of VW's reputation was proof that without his iron hand, the shopkeepers, his cousins, were incapable of greatness. But Piëch had one last weapon to deploy, a financial nuclear option designed to destabilize the family one final time. In 2017, putting his affairs in order, Ferdinand Piëch decided to sever the last biological and financial link to the dynasty. He announced his intention to sell his massive stake in Porsche SE, the holding company that controls Volkswagen. This block of shares, representing nearly 15% of the voting rights, was the keystone of the family's power. If he sold it to an outsider, a Chinese conglomerate, a sovereign wealth fund from the Middle East, or a hedge fund, the Porsche Piëch clan would lose their absolute grip on the empire. It was a threat of the highest order. He was holding a gun to the head of the family trust. The panic in Zelensky was palpable. To prevent the shares from leaving the bloodline, the family had to buy him out. But they didn't have the liquid cash lying around. Their wealth was tied up in stock. The buyer who stepped forward was Hans Michael Piëch, Ferdinand's younger brother, a lawyer who had spent his life operating in the shadows. To save the family control, Hans Michael had to leverage himself to the hilt, borrowing over €1 billion to buy Ferdinand's shares. The transaction was the ultimate FU from Ferdinand. He forced his own brother and cousins to go into massive debt just to maintain the status quo. He cashed out, taking roughly €1 billion with him, washing his hands of the family drama forever. He left them with the burden of ownership, while he walked away with the freedom of liquidity. 2 years later, on August 25, 2019, the final curtain fell. Ferdinand Piëch collapsed while having dinner at a restaurant in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was 82 years old. He died in a hospital shortly after, surrounded not by the weeping cousins he had tormented for 50 years, but by the silence he had cultivated. The news of his death sent a shockwave through the automotive world. Tributes poured in calling him the greatest carman of the century, the father of the Quattro and the Veyron. But the reaction from the family was notably muted. There was no outpouring of grief from Wolfgang Porsche. The funeral was a private, restricted affair. Even in death, he remained the dangerous isotope in the family reactor. With the tyrant gone, one might have expected the Porsche-Piëch dynasty to finally find peace. But the mechanism of their dysfunction is self-perpetuating. The departure of Piëch simply shifted the anxiety to a new threat, the irrelevance of the internal combustion engine. As the 2020s dawned, the automotive industry faced its biggest existential crisis since the invention of the car, the transition to electric vehicles, EVs, and software-defined mobility. Tesla was rising. Chinese manufacturers like BYD were moving fast. Volkswagen, the giant that Piëch built, was suddenly looking like a dinosaur, heavy, slow, and burdened by a legacy of diesel fumes. Wolfgang Porsche, now an old man himself, realized that the family needed to make one last desperate maneuver to secure their legacy. They needed to reclaim the soul of the family. They needed to take Porsche AG, the sports car maker, public. The IPO of Porsche AG in September 2022 was the closing of the circle that began with the failed takeover in 2008. In a complex financial ballet, Volkswagen AG spun off Porsche AG as a separate public company. This allowed the Porsche Piëch family via their holding company Porsche SE to buy a blocking minority stake, 25% plus one share, in the sports car maker. Forensically, this was a masterstroke of emotional accounting. For decades, since the 2009 takeover, the family had felt like tenants in their own house, owning shares in the massive VW group, but having lost direct control of the family jewel, the 911 factory. The 2022 IPO allowed them to buy back that direct control. They paid a premium, funded by yet more debt, to regain the voting rights that allowed them to veto any major decision regarding the Porsche brand. It was a victory for Wolfgang Porsche. He had finally undone the humiliation of 2009. He had brought the David back home, separating it slightly from the Goliath. But the irony is staggering. To buy back their own company, they had to list it on the stock market, selling half of it to global investors. They sold the furniture to buy back the house. Today, the Porsche Piëch dynasty stands as a paradox of modern capitalism. They are one of the wealthiest families in human history, with a combined net worth estimated at over $40 billion. They control the largest car manufacturer in Europe. They sit on the boards of companies that employ nearly 700,000 people. But look closer at the Schuttgut estate in Zell-am-See, the spiritual heart of the clan. The private cemetery there holds the bones of Ferdinand Porsche, the man who shook hands with Hitler. It holds the bones of Ferry Porsche, the dreamer. And now, somewhere in the landscape of history, lies the shadow of Ferdinand Piëch, the tyrant. The living members, Wolfgang Porsche, Hans Michael Piëch, and the rising fourth generation, are bound together not by love, but by a mechanism called the shareholder agreement. They cannot sell their shares without offering them to family members first. They are trapped in a golden cage. If they try to leave, they lose their power. If they stay, they must endure the eternal friction of the two clans. The Cold War continues, but the weapons have changed. It is no longer about stealing wives or bugging boardrooms. It is about capital allocation. The family is pushing Volkswagen to close factories in Germany to cut costs, a brutal move that echoes the ruthlessness of their grandfather. They are fighting over who will lead the transition to electric cars. They are terrified that the Chinese will do to them what they did to the British and Italian car industries. The ultimate tragedy of the Porsche Piëch dynasty is that they achieved everything the original Ferdinand Porsche dreamed of, and yet they possess nothing of true value. They have the people's car, but they are hated by the people for cheating them. They have the best sports car in the world, but it is built by a corporate monolith, not an artisan workshop. They have all the money in the world, but they spent 50 years destroying their own bloodline to get it. The mask of happiness remains firmly in place. When the annual general meeting takes place, the cousins will stand on the stage, gray-haired and impeccably tailored, smiling for the cameras as the dividend yield is announced. They will shake hands. They will speak of heritage and tradition. But behind the eyes, the calculation never stops. The ghost of Ferdinand Piëch is still in the room, whispering that trust is a weakness, that family is just another competitor, and that, in the end, the only thing that matters is who holds the keys to the tank. The dynasty that was forged in the fires of World War II has cooled into a block of solid, impenetrable ice. They have won the race, but they are the only ones left on the track, driving in circles faster and faster, simply waiting for the fuel to run out.